You can tell a lot about a man by how he reacts when a weapon is pointed at him. But sometimes, the most dangerous thing in the room is the man who doesn't react at all. The sharp voice echoed across the training ground just after noon, cutting through the steady hum of conversation and the distant crack of practice drills. A circle of Marine Corps cadets had formed near the edge of the observation area, their uniforms crisp, their confidence even sharper. At the center of that circle stood an old man. He looked completely out of place. His faded olive jacket hung loosely from narrow shoulders. His gray hair moved gently in the warm North Carolina breeze. Deep lines marked his face, each one etched there by decades of living. He looked less like a threat and more like a grandfather who had wandered into the wrong place. That was exactly what Cadet Ethan Brooks believed. "I asked you a question," Ethan snapped, stepping closer. Around him, several other cadets exchanged amused looks. They were nearing graduation. Soon they would earn the right to lead Marines. Confidence came naturally to young men who had spent years proving themselves. Sometimes too naturally. The old man remained silent. His pale blue eyes rested calmly on Ethan without challenge, without fear, and without the slightest sign of concern. That calm irritated Ethan more than any argument could have. "Sir, this area is restricted," he said. "You can't just sit here and watch training exercises." The old man slowly shifted his gaze toward the firing range nearly 300 yards away. Rows of targets stood under the bright afternoon sun while instructors moved among groups of cadets. Everything about the scene felt routine. Everything except him. "Did you hear me?" Ethan demanded. Finally, the old man nodded once. "I heard you." His voice was low and rough, like gravel worn smooth by time. "Then why aren't you leaving?" Ethan asked. The old man looked back toward the range. "Because I was invited." A few cadets laughed. Ethan smirked. "Invited by who?" The old man didn't answer immediately. Instead, his eyes drifted toward the American flag flying above the base headquarters. The fabric moved steadily against the blue sky. "Someone who remembers me," he said at last. The answer only fueled the amusement around him. One cadet shook his head. Another rolled his eyes. To them, the old man sounded confused, maybe even senile. Ethan took another step forward. "You have identification?" The old man reached slowly into his jacket pocket and handed over a visitor badge. Ethan studied it. The card displayed only a name. Jack Mercer. No rank. No title. No decorations. Nothing remarkable. Ethan looked up. "That's it." Jack simply nodded. "That's enough." The response triggered another round of laughter. Ethan handed the badge back with exaggerated disappointment. "You know, Mr. Mercer, people usually need more than a first and last name around here." Jack accepted the card and slipped it back into his pocket. His expression never changed. That bothered Ethan more than he cared to admit. Most people became nervous when challenged. Most people explained themselves. Most people wanted approval. This man wanted none of it. The wind shifted. Dust rolled lightly across the pavement. Somewhere behind them, a whistle sounded. Yet within the small circle surrounding Jack Mercer, the atmosphere tightened. Ethan folded his arms. "You really think you belong here?" Jack's eyes met his again. Calm. Steady. Unmoving. "Son," he said quietly, "I've been standing around Marines longer than you've been alive." The laughter disappeared. Not because the words were threatening. Because for the first time, something about the old man felt different. Older. Heavier. Like there was a story nobody in that circle understood. Ethan felt it too. And instead of listening to that feeling, he decided to challenge it. For a moment, nobody spoke. The afternoon heat settled over the training ground like a heavy blanket, and the distant sounds of drills seemed strangely muted. Ethan Brooks stared at Jack Mercer, trying to decide whether the old man was confident or simply stubborn. Neither explanation felt right. There was something unsettling about the way he stood there. Not proud, not defensive, just completely at ease. Most visitors who found themselves surrounded by Marine cadets became nervous. Some apologized. Others tried to explain themselves. Jack Mercer did neither. He simply stood beneath the bright Carolina sun as though he belonged there more than anyone else. Ethan forced a laugh. That is a pretty big claim for somebody wearing a visitor badge. Several cadets joined in. The tension eased slightly, but only on the surface. Jack looked toward the firing range again. Rows of targets shimmered in the heat nearly 300 yards away. Instructors moved between stations while young Marines practiced drills they had repeated hundreds of times. Things have changed, Ethan said. Marine Corps is different now. Jack nodded slowly. It should be. The answer caught Ethan off guard. He had expected an argument. Instead, the old man sounded almost pleased. You do not think your generation was tougher? One cadet asked. Jack glanced at him. Every generation thinks that. A few smiles appeared. Even Ethan felt one tugging at the corner of his mouth before he pushed it away. The old man was not supposed to be winning people over. So what exactly are you doing here? Ethan asked. Watching. Watching what? Marines. The simplicity of the answer irritated him all over again. Ethan folded his arms. You keep talking like you know something about this place. Jack's pale eyes met his. I know enough. A gust of wind swept across the observation area. The American flag snapped sharply above headquarters. Jack watched it for a second longer than seemed necessary. There was something almost reflective in his expression, as though the sight carried memories nobody else could see. Ethan noticed it and mistook it for weakness. Let me guess, he said. You served a long time ago, and now you come back to tell stories about the good old days. Jack smiled faintly. It was the first expression anyone had seen from him. No. The good old days were not nearly as good as people remember. A few cadets exchanged glances. The answer sounded genuine, honest. It lacked the exaggerated nostalgia they expected from older veterans. Ethan disliked that too. Every response seemed to rob him of an easy target. Nearby, a pair of instructors walked past the observation area. Neither paid attention to the gathering. The training schedule continued uninterrupted. Yet the circle around Jack Mercer continued to grow. More cadets drifted closer. Curiosity had replaced amusement. Jack noticed, but appeared unconcerned. He slipped his hands into the pockets of his faded jacket and looked across the range. The movement caused one side of the jacket to pull slightly open. For only a second, something became visible near the inside pocket. A small piece of worn fabric. Dark red. Frayed with age. Ethan spotted it immediately. So did several others. It looked old. Very old. And unlike everything else about Jack Mercer, it looked like it had once meant something important. Jack Mercer shifted slightly, the afternoon sun glinting off the faded insignia on his jacket, a patch nearly worn through from decades of use. The cadets circled tighter, their movements nervous but carefully measured, as if they were anticipating something they could not yet see. Ethan Brooks took a step back, squinting to get a better view of the small emblem. It was frayed at the edges and stained with time, yet it radiated an authority that seemed to demand acknowledgement. Jack's eyes remained fixed forward, his posture relaxed yet purposeful, as if the years had taught him exactly how to occupy space without drawing unnecessary attention. The wind carried the faint scent of earth and gunpowder from the range, mixing with the distant shouts of instructors guiding the next series of drills. A cadet whispered to another, pointing subtly at the patch, and a ripple of curiosity passed through the group. Jack noticed without shifting his gaze. There was no pride, no arrogance, only the quiet weight of someone who had been recognized for competence long before words could describe it. Ethan crouched slightly, examining the way Jack's hands rested at his sides, the faint tremor of age just barely perceptible. What does that mean? He asked softly, more to himself than to anyone else. The words hung in the air, a challenge in their own right. Jack finally spoke, his voice low and measured. It means you are standing near someone who has seen more than you will in a lifetime. The words were simple, yet carried a depth that drew involuntary attention. Cadets shifted uncomfortably, unsure if they were meant to respond or remain silent. A light breeze moved across the range, lifting dust and debris in slow eddies, emphasizing the stillness that had settled around Jack Mercer. His gaze drifted slightly to the horizon, as if the past and present were layered in the heat shimmer of the afternoon. Ethan tried to mask a frown, trying to assert authority, but the effect was diminished by Jack's unwavering presence. The old man's eyes held a clarity, a calm that was almost unsettling to those used to measuring authority by age or rank alone. A few cadets glanced at each other, their earlier laughter replaced with quiet uncertainty. Then a rustle of paper came from a clipboard held by a supervising instructor nearby. He had noticed the patch as well and stopped mid-step, pausing to consider what he was seeing. The moment stretched, heavy with unspoken tension. Jack's hands moved subtly into his pockets again, brushing against the leather edge of the small, aged object tucked inside. It was only a few inches wide, yet it carried decades of history. Cadets leaned in unconsciously, drawn by the aura it projected without a word. The instructor cleared his throat softly, drawing the attention of those around him. Ethan's eyes flicked toward the instructor and back to Jack, frustration simmering. The old man had not flinched. He had not even acknowledged the raised eyebrows or the curious stares. In that silence, the weight of his experience pressed down, filling the space more effectively than any explanation could. The cadets realized, perhaps too late, that this was a man whose presence alone demanded respect, whose story had already been written long before they had set foot on the base, and whose quiet observation was a lesson in itself. The instructor, who had paused several yards away, finally started walking toward the group. His pace was not hurried, but it was deliberate enough to catch Ethan Brooks's attention. The cadets parted slightly as he approached. Staff Sergeant Nolan Pierce had spent nearly 18 years in the Marine Corps, and unlike the cadets, he had learned to trust his instincts. Right now, every instinct he had was telling him that something about Jack Mercer deserved a closer look. Ethan noticed the staff sergeant's focus and immediately straightened his posture. "Everything is under control, Staff Sergeant," he said. Pierce did not answer right away. His eyes remained fixed on the frayed patch partially hidden inside Jack's jacket. Time had nearly erased its colors, but not its shape. A strange expression crossed the staff sergeant's face. Recognition, confusion, then concern. "Sir," Pierce said carefully, addressing Jack directly, "would you mind showing me that patch?" The atmosphere shifted immediately. The joking mood vanished. Even the wind seemed quieter. Jack studied the younger Marine for several seconds before slowly reaching into his jacket. The movement was calm and unhurried. He pulled out a small square of worn fabric attached to an even older backing. The edges were frayed. The stitching had faded, yet the symbol at its center was still visible. Pierce's eyes widened slightly. Ethan frowned. To him, it looked like nothing more than an old military patch that belonged in a museum. "What is it?" one cadet asked. Pierce did not answer. His attention never left the fabric. "Where did you get this?" he asked softly. Jack almost smiled. "They gave it to me a long time ago." "Who?" Ethan asked. Jack looked toward the range again. "The men who wore it." The answer frustrated Ethan. Every response seemed wrapped in another layer of mystery. "You keep talking in riddles," he said. "If it is so important, why does nobody recognize it?" Jack glanced at him. "Because the people who would recognize it are mostly gone." Silence followed. Somewhere across the training field, a whistle sounded and a formation began moving toward another exercise station. Life on the base continued. Yet around Jack Mercer, time felt strangely suspended. Staff Sergeant Pierce carefully handed the patch back. His expression had become difficult to read. "Sir," he said quietly, "would you mind waiting here for a few minutes?" Ethan immediately noticed the change in tone. The staff sergeant was no longer questioning Jack. He was showing respect. Real respect. The kind that could not be faked. "Why?" Ethan asked. Pierce ignored him. His gaze remained fixed on Jack. "Please." Jack nodded once. "I am not going anywhere." Pierce pulled a phone from his pocket and stepped away from the group. Ethan watched him walk nearly 50 yards before stopping near the edge of the observation area. The staff sergeant looked back twice before placing a call. That alone was unusual. More unusual was what happened next. The moment someone answered, Pierce straightened instinctively. Not because regulations required it. Because whoever was on the other end of that call outranked him by a considerable margin. Ethan felt a knot forming in his stomach. He could not explain why. Nothing had happened. No names had been revealed. No stories had been told. Yet the certainty he had felt earlier was beginning to crack. For the first time that afternoon, he looked at Jack Mercer and wondered whether he had misunderstood everything from the very beginning. Jack Mercer accepted the patch and carefully slid it back inside his jacket. His fingers lingered on the worn fabric for only a moment, but that moment was enough. The sounds of the training ground seemed to fade. The warm Carolina air disappeared. The bright afternoon sunlight dissolved into another sky entirely. A sky covered by low gray clouds moving over distant hills. The scent of freshly cut grass vanished, replaced by damp earth and rain-soaked canvas. 40 years earlier, Jack had been young. Not fearless, not invincible, just young. He remembered the weight of responsibility more than anything else. He remembered the silence before dawn, the kind of silence every Marine learns to respect. Around him, members of his unit moved carefully through the darkness, checking gear, exchanging quiet words, preparing for another long day. Nobody spoke loudly. Nobody needed to. They all understood the same thing. The mission mattered. The men beside them mattered more. The patch had belonged to that unit, a small reconnaissance team whose existence rarely appeared in official histories. They were not famous. They were not celebrated. Most Americans would never hear their names. Yet Jack remembered every face, every voice, every promise made beneath foreign skies. The patch itself had started as a joke. One of the Marines had drawn the symbol on a scrap of cardboard during a rainstorm after weeks in the field. The design was simple, rough, imperfect. Somehow it stayed. Before long it appeared on packs, jackets, and helmets. Not because regulations approved it, because it meant something. It meant trust. It meant that when things became difficult, nobody would be left behind. Years later, the colors faded. The fabric frayed. The memories never did. Jack remembered a young lieutenant standing beside him during one particularly difficult operation. Fresh from training. Intelligent. Determined. Eager to prove himself. The lieutenant had carried maps everywhere and worried constantly about making mistakes. Jack had spent weeks teaching him lessons that could never be found in manuals. How to read a landscape. How to stay calm when everyone else was nervous. How to listen before speaking. The young officer absorbed every lesson. By the end, he no longer looked like someone trying to become a leader. He looked like one. Jack never forgot that. Back in the present, Staff Sergeant Nolan Pierce lowered his phone and stared across the range. The conversation had lasted less than 2 minutes. Yet the effect was obvious. The color had drained slightly from his face. He immediately placed a second call. Then a third. Ethan Brooks noticed. So did every cadet nearby. Nobody understood why a worn patch and an elderly visitor suddenly required multiple calls through the chain of command. Pierce finished speaking and slowly returned toward the group. His expression had changed completely. The confidence of a senior instructor remained, but now it was accompanied by something else. Respect. Genuine respect. Ethan felt the knot in his stomach tighten. Because for the first time all afternoon, the question was no longer who Jack Mercer was. The question had become how important he must be for experienced Marines to react this way. And somewhere deep inside, Ethan was beginning to suspect that every assumption he had made about the old man had been wrong. Staff Sergeant Nolan Pierce stopped a few feet from Jack Mercer and came to a complete halt. The cadets immediately noticed the difference. Only minutes earlier, he had approached like an instructor managing a minor situation. Now he looked like a Marine trying very carefully not to make a mistake. The change was impossible to ignore. Ethan Brooks felt it more than anyone. "Staff Sergeant?" he asked. Pierce did not answer immediately. His eyes remained on Jack. "Sir," he said quietly, "would you mind if I asked you a question?" Jack nodded. "Go ahead. Were you ever assigned to Camp Ridgeline?" A faint smile appeared at the corner of Jack's mouth. "A long time ago." Pierce swallowed. "Training Battalion 7? For a while." Several cadets exchanged confused glances. The names meant little to them. Ethan frowned. "What does that have to do with anything?" Pierce finally looked at him. "Everything." The answer landed harder than Ethan expected. The staff sergeant took a slow breath and glanced toward the administration building nearly 400 yards away. His phone vibrated again. He checked the screen and immediately straightened. "Excuse me," he said before answering. This time he moved only a few feet away. Everyone could hear fragments of the conversation. "Yes, sir." A pause. "Yes, sir, he is here." Another pause. "Understood, sir." Then another. "Absolutely, sir." When the call ended, the color had drained from his face even more. Around them, the training schedule continued. Recruits marched across distant sections of the base. Instructors shouted commands. Vehicles moved along service roads. Yet inside the growing circle surrounding Jack Mercer, the atmosphere had become strangely still. Ethan hated the feeling. He hated not understanding what was happening. "Can somebody explain this?" he finally asked. Pierce looked at him carefully. "Cadet Brooks, how many instructors have trained you during your time here?" "Dozens." "And how many stories have you heard about Marines who became legends?" Ethan shrugged. "A lot." Pierce nodded slowly. "Most of those stories grow over time. Details get exaggerated. Facts get blurred. His eyes drifted toward Jack. But every once in a while, you meet someone whose story was so extraordinary that people actually tell less than what really happened. Silence followed. Ethan felt his confidence slipping. He looked at the old man again. The faded jacket, the weathered face, the calm blue eyes. Nothing about him looked extraordinary. Yet somehow that made the situation more unsettling. Jack remained completely relaxed. He sat down on a nearby bench and watched the range as if none of this concerned him. A group of younger cadets arrived and immediately noticed the tension. Conversations dropped to whispers. Questions spread. Nobody seemed willing to leave. Then another vehicle appeared in the distance. A dark government sedan turned onto the service road and headed directly toward the observation area. Pierce saw it first. His posture stiffened. Ethan followed his gaze. The sedan was moving far too quickly for an ordinary administrative visit. Dust trailed behind it as it crossed the base. Jack watched it approach without the slightest change in expression, almost as though he already knew who was coming. And for the first time all afternoon, Ethan Brooks felt something he had not expected to feel around an 84-year-old man. He felt nervous. The black sedan rolled across the training grounds and came to a stop near the observation area. The engine had barely gone silent before the driver's door opened. A Marine captain stepped out first. Then another officer emerged from the rear passenger side. Staff Sergeant Nolan Pierce immediately came to attention. The reaction did not go unnoticed. Ethan Brooks watched closely. The arriving officer was not a general. Not yet. But the silver eagle on his collar marked him as a full colonel, a rank that carried enough authority to change the atmosphere of an entire base. Conversation stopped. Cadets straightened instinctively. The colonel moved with purpose, scanning the crowd until his eyes landed on Jack Mercer. Then something unexpected happened. He slowed down. Not because he was uncertain, because he was suddenly careful. Very careful. The colonel approached until he stood only a few feet away from the old Marine. For a moment, he simply stared. Ethan expected questions, identification checks, formal introductions. Instead, the colonel's expression softened. "Sir," he said quietly, "it really is you." Jack looked up from the bench. A faint smile crossed his weathered face. "Good afternoon, Colonel." The officer exhaled slowly. "I was hoping the report was wrong." A few cadets exchanged confused looks. Hoping it was wrong? Ethan felt even more lost than before. The colonel glanced toward Pierce. "Who else knows?" "Only a handful of us, sir." The colonel nodded. "Keep it that way for now." Those words landed heavily. For now? Not forever. Ethan noticed that detail immediately. Whatever secret surrounded Jack Mercer was growing larger by the minute. The colonel turned back toward Jack. "I cannot believe you came without notifying anyone." "I came to watch Marines train," Jack replied. "Not cause a commotion." The colonel almost laughed. "Sir, your definition of a commotion is different from everyone else's." A few Marines nearby smiled despite themselves. The familiarity between them was obvious. They were not speaking like strangers. They were speaking like men connected by history. The colonel's phone suddenly rang. He checked the screen, and his posture changed instantly. "Yes, sir," he answered. Silence followed. Then another, "Yes, sir." Then a third. Around him, nobody moved. Even the wind seemed to pause. When the call ended, the colonel lowered the phone slowly. He looked at Jack, then toward the distant headquarters building, then back again. "Sir," he said carefully, "he is on his way." Jack sighed almost imperceptibly. "That was unnecessary." "With respect, sir," the colonel replied. "That was never going to be my decision." Ethan felt the knot in his stomach tighten further. He had spent years learning Marine traditions, studying leadership, memorizing history. Yet he had never seen senior officers behave this way around anyone, especially not around a quiet old man wearing a faded jacket. The colonel remained standing beside Jack rather than above him. That detail struck Ethan more than anything else. It was subtle, easy to miss, but Marines understood hierarchy. And right now, a full colonel was positioning himself like a student standing beside a respected instructor. In the distance, another vehicle appeared, larger this time, moving faster. The moment the colonel saw it, he quietly adjusted his uniform. Staff Sergeant Pierce did the same. And Ethan Brooks suddenly realized that whatever was about to happen next was far bigger than he had imagined. The dark sedan stopped fully, and the rear door opened with precision. Lieutenant General Robert Hargrove stepped out, his polished shoes making a faint crunch against the gravel. His gaze immediately found Jack Mercer, and the recognition in his eyes was unmistakable. Ethan Brooks felt a sudden shift in the atmosphere. The general's presence carried weight that silenced even the murmurs of the cadets. Jack rose slowly from the bench, adjusting the faded jacket without a word. The general approached, each step deliberate, maintaining perfect military composure. Staff Sergeant Pierce stood at attention, the tension between old experience and current command palpable. "Jack," the general said, his voice steady but carrying years of command. "I never thought I would see you here." Jack nodded, the corners of his mouth lifting just slightly. "Sir," he replied, his tone calm and unhurried. "I came to watch the training." The general looked around the cadets, noting the mixture of awe and confusion in their expressions. "They do not understand yet," he said softly, almost to himself. Ethan tried to follow, but the nuances of respect and hierarchy were beyond his comprehension at that moment. The general's hand hovered near the insignia on his uniform, an unspoken acknowledgement of shared history. He then turned his attention fully back to Jack, studying the man as though measuring every detail against memories decades old. The cadets sensed the weight of the moment. Every movement, every glance, held significance. They could feel the quiet authority radiating from both men, a magnetic pull that shifted the energy of the entire training ground. Jack remained composed, his pale blue eyes meeting those of the general without hesitation. There was understanding in that gaze, a recognition that transcended time. Ethan noticed how even Staff Sergeant Pierce seemed to defer instinctively, the chain of command bending subtly to honor the past accomplishments of a man who appeared otherwise ordinary. The general finally spoke, his tone deliberate, commanding attention without raising his voice. "Cadets, step back. Give him space." The instruction was obeyed instantly. Ethan's eyes widened as he realized the gravity of the command, the respect demanded by a single figure, and how Jack Mercer stood at the center of it, unassuming yet undeniably commanding. The general stepped closer, signaling subtly for the cadets to remain silent. He gestured toward Jack's jacket and the small worn patch that had drawn attention earlier. "Every stitch, every thread tells a story," he said, his voice low but resonant, carrying across the few yards between them. "Stories of commitment, courage, and sacrifice that are not written in any manual." The cadets were silent, the words settling over them like a lesson they could feel rather than hear. Ethan struggled to grasp the significance, sensing that all their assumptions about Jack Mercer, the quiet observer, were about to be irrevocably changed. The general's eyes softened slightly as he regarded Jack, a mixture of admiration and relief passing between them. "You did not come here for recognition," the general continued. "You came because it was time for others to witness what true experience looks like." Jack's expression remained modest, almost dismissive of the praise, yet his presence carried the weight of a lifetime of service. The cadets absorbed the scene, each one silently acknowledging that the man before them was no ordinary visitor. The general finally took a half step back, his eyes scanning the group one last time before resting again on Jack. In that instant, Ethan felt a lesson penetrate more deeply than any instruction on the firing range or in the classroom. Respect was not given lightly. It was earned through time, dedication, and deeds that spoke louder than words. The quiet understanding passed through the circle, leaving the cadets in a state of attentive stillness, fully aware that they had witnessed the approach of a legacy and the presence of someone who had defined it. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The training ground that had seemed so busy only moments earlier now felt frozen in place. The distant sounds of drills continued somewhere beyond the observation area, but they seemed impossibly far away. Lieutenant General Robert Hargrove looked at the gathered cadets, then back at Jack Mercer. There was a weight in his expression that could only come from memory. "Most of you have spent years studying leadership," he said. "You have memorized doctrine. You have learned procedures. You have trained for responsibility." His gaze settled on Ethan Brooks. "But some lessons cannot be found in books." Ethan felt every eye turned toward him. He wanted to look away. He could not. The general continued. 40 years ago, I was a young lieutenant who thought I understood everything." A faint smile crossed Jack's face. "You were not that bad," he said. A few quiet laughs rippled through the crowd. Even the general smiled. That depends on who you ask. Then his expression grew serious again. What I do know is this. The Marine standing beside me taught me more about leadership in 6 months than any school ever could. Silence settled once more. Ethan stared at Jack, the old man who had arrived alone. The old man nobody recognized. The old man he had judged within seconds. The general slowly reached into his pocket and removed a small photograph protected by a clear sleeve. Time had faded the image. The corners were worn. He handed it to Ethan. Ethan looked down. A group of young Marines stood together beneath a foreign sky. Mud stained their uniforms. Exhaustion showed on every face. At the center stood a much younger Jack Mercer. Even in the faded photograph, there was something familiar about his eyes. That photograph stays on my desk, the general said quietly. Every day. Ethan swallowed hard. Around him, the other cadets remained completely still. Why, he asked. The general's answer came without hesitation. Because every person in that picture became a better Marine because of him. Jack shook his head slightly. That is enough, General. No, sir, Hargrove replied. It is not. The general turned toward the cadets. You see an elderly man in a worn jacket. I see one of the finest Marines I have ever known. The words landed with the force of absolute truth. Nobody challenged them. Nobody could. Ethan stepped forward. His face felt warm despite the afternoon breeze. Sir, he said to Jack, his voice quieter than before, I owe you an apology. Jack studied him for a moment. Then he nodded. Maybe. Ethan blinked. Several cadets looked confused. Jack's expression softened. The apology is not for me. He looked around the training ground. The lesson is simple. Never decide what someone is worth before you know their story. No one spoke after that. They did not need to. The message settled over the observation area like a final order. A few moments later, Jack Mercer adjusted his faded jacket and began walking toward the parking area. The general watched him go. So did the colonel. So did every cadet present. No speeches followed. No ceremony was needed. The quiet respect in their eyes said more than words ever could. And as Ethan Brooks watched the old Marine disappear into the afternoon sunlight, he realized that the most important lesson of his training had not come from an instructor, a manual, or a classroom. It had come from a man who never once asked for recognition, because he had earned it long ago. Some men do not need to remind the world who they are. The people who remember do that for them.